Long before the marble temples of Greece became symbols of philosophy, art, and democracy, there were darker rituals whispered about in ancient texts, rituals that blurred the line between religion and brutality. Imagine a prisoner standing in chains before a crowd gathered under the scorching Mediterranean sun. Around him rise stone altars blackened by centuries of sacrifice. Priests chant ancient hymns. The air smells of smoke, blood, and burning offerings meant to appease the gods. But on this day, the offering is not an animal. It is a human being. In the earliest layers of Greek myth and ritual tradition, scattered references hint at something deeply unsettling. Ceremonies where prisoners of war, criminals, or outsiders were transformed into living sacrifices, human offerings meant to calm divine wrath or cleanse a city of pollution and misfortune. To later generations, these stories became uncomfortable relics half buried beneath the glory of classical Greece. But behind the legends lies a darker truth, because in times of war, plague, and divine fear, ancient societies sometimes turned human lives into ritual currency, offering flesh and blood to gods believed capable of destroying entire civilizations. This is the forgotten story of a Greek ritual where prisoners became offerings, and the terrifying belief system that made it possible. Ancient Greece is often remembered as the birthplace of philosophy, democracy, and rational thought. The names of thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle dominate our image of Greek civilization. Yet this intellectual world existed alongside a far older system of beliefs, one rooted in fear, divine appeasement, and ritual sacrifice. For the Greeks, the gods were not distant spiritual figures. They were powerful forces who controlled storms, earthquakes, disease, harvests, and war. Every aspect of life depended on maintaining favor with these divine beings. And the gods, according to Greek belief, were unpredictable. They could be generous one moment and devastating the next. A failed harvest might be interpreted as divine anger. A plague sweeping through a city could be seen as punishment for hidden sins. Military defeat might signal that the gods had abandoned their people to restore balance between humans and the divine world. The Greeks relied heavily on ritual sacrifice. Animals, especially bulls, sheep, and goats, were offered regularly on altars across the Greek world. Blood flowed across stone platforms as priests prayed for protection, victory, or forgiveness. But beneath these common practices existed something more disturbing. Ancient Greek mythology contains repeated references to human sacrifice. The story of Iphigenia describes a princess offered to the goddess Artemis so the Greek fleet could sail to Troy. In another myth, the hero Theseus must travel to Crete, where young Athenians are sent as sacrificial victims to the monstrous Minotaur. These myths are often interpreted symbolically today, but ancient sources sometimes hint that these stories may have been rooted in older ritual traditions, practices that survived from prehistoric cultures, long before classical Greek society emerged. Archaeological discoveries in places like Crete have revealed human remains associated with ritual contexts dating back to the Bronze Age. While scholars debate the exact meaning of these finds, they suggest that the possibility of ritualized human sacrifice cannot be entirely dismissed in early Greek religious practice. By the time of the classical Greek city-states, however, direct human sacrifice had largely disappeared or at least become extremely rare. Yet traces of those darker traditions lingered. One such ritual was known as the pharmakos. The pharmakos ritual was performed during times of extreme crisis, plagues, famines, or natural disasters that threatened the survival of a community. The basic idea was chilling. A human being would be selected to carry the pollution, sins, or misfortune of the entire city. This individual would become a scapegoat, and through ritual humiliation, violence, and sometimes death, the community believed it could transfer its suffering onto that one unfortunate body. Often, the victims were outsiders, criminals, slaves, or prisoners of war, people whose lives already held little value within the social order. In the eyes of the ritual, they were expendable. But to understand why such rituals existed, we must look deeper into the psychology of ancient societies where fear of divine punishment could push entire communities toward acts that today seem almost unimaginable. Religion in ancient Greece was not merely a private spiritual belief. It was woven deeply into the political and social structure of every city-state. Priests, magistrates, and civic leaders oversaw rituals meant to protect the entire community. These ceremonies were not optional acts of devotion. They were considered necessary acts of survival, because if the gods were angered, the consequences could be catastrophic. Ancient writers often described cities struck by disasters that seemed impossible to explain. Plagues could wipe out thousands of people within weeks. Crops could fail year after year. Earthquakes could level entire towns. Without modern science to explain such events, ancient societies searched for moral or divine causes. Perhaps the city had committed an offense against the gods. Perhaps some hidden crime had polluted the community. Or perhaps a supernatural force had infected the population with spiritual contamination. Known as miasma, the concept of miasma was central to Greek thinking. It referred to a kind of spiritual pollution that could spread through a community. Like an invisible disease, murder, sacrilege, or other crimes could create miasma, bringing divine punishment upon everyone. To cleanse the city, extreme rituals were sometimes performed. And this is where the pharmakos ritual emerged. The word itself carries a dark irony. In Greek, pharmakos is related to the word pharmakon, which means both poison and medicine. The scapegoat was both. He was the poison of the community, the embodiment of its sins and misfortunes. But he was also the medicine, the cure meant to restore balance between humans and the gods. The selection of a pharmakos was often deeply symbolic. The victim was usually someone on the margins of society, a criminal condemned for previous crimes, a slave with no political rights, or a prisoner captured in war. Such individuals could be sacrificed without destabilizing the social order. Once chosen, the pharmakos would be subjected to a ritual that combined humiliation, violence, and symbolic purification. Ancient sources describe the victim being paraded through the streets of the city. Crowds gathered to watch. The atmosphere was not simply religious, it was theatrical. The entire community participated in transferring its fears and anger onto the victim. In some accounts, the pharmakos was beaten with branches or stones as he was led through the city. Foods such as figs or barley cakes might be hung around his neck, symbols associated with fertility and purification. The meaning was clear. The scapegoat was absorbing the misfortune of the entire population. At the end of the ritual procession, the victim would be expelled from the city. But some ancient accounts suggest that the ritual could become far more violent. In certain extreme circumstances, the pharmakos might be executed, burned, thrown from cliffs, or killed in other ways believed to appease the gods. Whether such executions were common or rare remains debated among historians. What matters most is the psychological logic behind the ritual. A frightened population needed a way to explain disaster, and nothing was more powerful than the belief that suffering could be transferred to a single body. This ritual created a terrifying form of collective violence. Entire communities could unite in punishing a scapegoat. Through this act, fear was transformed into control. But for the unfortunate individuals chosen as pharmakoi, the ritual meant becoming the physical embodiment of a city's terror. They were no longer seen as human beings. They had become offerings. One of the most detailed descriptions of the pharmakos ritual comes from the ancient Greek city of Massalia, modern-day Marseille, founded by Greek settlers along the Mediterranean coast. According to later historical sources, Massalia faced periods of extreme crisis, plague, famine, economic collapse. When such disasters struck, the people believed the city had fallen out of harmony with the gods, and drastic measures were required to restore balance. In these moments, a pharmakos would be chosen. The selection process itself was cruelly calculated. Often the victim was a condemned criminal or prisoner, someone already living on the edge of death. The man would be kept alive by the city for a year, fed and cared for just enough to survive. At first glance, this might appear merciful, but it was something far darker. The city was preparing its sacrifice. When the time came for the ritual, the victim was brought before the population. He was dressed in strange garments, sometimes decorated with sacred symbols. Food offerings were hung from his body, figs, barley cakes, and other ritual objects associated with purification. Then the procession began. The man was led through the streets while the people gathered around him. Some accounts describe crowds shouting insults or striking him with branches. Others suggest the atmosphere was grim and solemn, but everyone understood what was happening. The man walking through the city carried their suffering. He was the vessel into which the city poured its fear, its guilt, its desperation. As the procession reached the outskirts of the city, the ritual intensified. The pharmakos might be beaten again, symbolically driving the pollution out of the city. Then came the final moment. In some versions of the ritual, the victim was expelled beyond the city borders. But in darker accounts, the ritual ended with death. The man might be stoned, thrown from a cliff, or burned as an offering to the gods. The act transformed him into something more than a criminal or prisoner. He had become a human sacrifice. His body was the payment offered to divine forces believed to control the fate of the city. To modern eyes, the cruelty of such rituals is almost unimaginable. Yet within the belief system of the time, the logic felt compelling. the suffering of one person could save thousands. And in moments of collective panic, communities often reach for explanations and solutions that place the burden of fear onto a single victim. For the man chosen as the pharmakos, the ritual must have been a nightmare beyond words. He would have known his fate long before the procession began. Every meal, every day of life leading up to the ceremony was simply a delay before death. And when the moment finally arrived, the entire city would gather to watch. Over time, rituals like the pharmakos began to fade from Greek society as philosophical thinking expanded and political systems evolved. Many Greeks themselves began to question older traditions rooted in fear and superstition. By the classical period, human sacrifice had become deeply controversial. Greek writers often described such practices as relics of a darker past. Some even projected them onto foreign cultures, portraying them as barbaric customs belonging to distant peoples rather than to Greece itself. This cultural shift was part of a broader transformation. Greek philosophers increasingly emphasized rational inquiry, ethics, and the nature of justice. Thinkers began asking difficult questions about morality and human responsibility. Could the suffering of one innocent person truly cleanse an entire community? Was it just to blame a single individual for disasters beyond human control? These questions gradually reshaped Greek thinking. Ritual sacrifice did not disappear entirely. Animal offerings continued for centuries, but the idea of human offerings became morally repulsive to many. Yet the psychological mechanism behind the pharmakos ritual did not vanish completely. The concept of the scapegoat remained deeply embedded in human societies. Even without ritual sacrifice, communities continued to search for individuals or groups to blame during times of crisis. Political leaders, minorities, outsiders, many have been turned into symbolic scapegoats throughout history. The ancient pharmakos ritual reveals how powerful this instinct can be. It shows how fear can transform entire communities into participants in collective violence. And it reminds us that even societies celebrated for their philosophy and culture were capable of terrifying acts. When confronted with disaster, the ancient Greeks gave the world some of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements: democracy, philosophy, and the foundations of Western science. But history is rarely simple. Behind the beauty of marble temples and the brilliance of Greek thought lies a deeper truth. Civilizations are capable of both enlightenment and cruelty. The pharmakos ritual exposes a darker layer of the ancient world, a moment when fear of divine punishment drove communities to sacrifice one of their own. In those rituals, a single human body became the container for an entire city's terror. The scapegoat carried their guilt, he carried their misfortune, and ultimately, he carried their hope that the gods might be satisfied with blood. These forgotten ceremonies remind us that progress is fragile. Even the most sophisticated societies can be driven by fear toward acts of shocking brutality. Because when people believe their survival depends on it, the line between justice and sacrifice can disappear, and in that moment, the fate of one unfortunate individual may become the price a civilization is willing to pay for its salvation.